Welcome to the Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professor Lecture, an event that is co-hosted by New York University and the Marion B. and Jacob K. Javits Foundation. Our lecture tonight is presented by Tony Bertelli, Professor of the Politics of Public Policy and Vice Dean of Academic Affairs and Research at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. I'm Sibel Raver. It's an honor to be here, Vice Provost for Research and Faculty Affairs at NYU. I bring warm regards from Provost David McLaughlin, who's unable to be here today, unfortunately, and I thank you for joining me, and Sherry Gleed, Dean of the Wagner School. The audience here today brings together scholars and practitioners from a range of academic and professional fields, reflecting Tony Bertelli's distinguished career and the very timely nature of tonight's topic: who are the policy workers and what are they doing? A citizen's perspective on democratic accountability in modern governance. Our audience includes members of our NYU community, faculty, staff, alumni, and students, and many guests to NYU whom I'm pleased to welcome. It's my special pleasure to welcome Mrs. Marion B. Javits, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Jacob K. Javits Foundation. She's the widow of the four-term Republican U.S. Senator from New York, the late Honorable Jacob K. Javits. A distinguished arts consultant and a patron of music and the arts, she's served on many state and national boards dealing with the arts and humanities, women's issues, and the rights of people with disabilities. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship at NYU is made possible through the generosity of Mrs. Javits. Please join me in saluting Mrs. Javits. Please join me, too, in greeting the leadership of the Jacob K. Javits Foundation, Mr. Jeffrey Keel, Carla Javits, the youngest daughter of Senator and Mrs. Javits, who serves as vice chair of the foundation. This evening, we're privileged to celebrate the rich legacy of Senator Jacob K. Javits. Thank you both. Yes. The Honorable Jacob K. Javits, who grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, shaped important legislation on civil rights, foreign affairs, and labor. From 1946 to 1954, he represented the New York's 21st Congressional District, including Manhattan's Upper West Side, in the U.S. House of Representatives. An alumnus of the NYU School of Law, he ran against the Democratic candidate Franklin Roosevelt Jr. and was elected New York State Attorney General in 1954. In 1956, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served 4 terms. I'd like to give you a sense of the special leadership of Senator Javits by quoting Mrs. Javits, who beautifully eulogized her late husband in her memoir, Senator's Wife, Ahead of My Time, published in 2013. Mrs. Javits wrote, and I quote, "The concept of power combined with ambition and a commitment to making the world better is an awesome and productive force. Jack Javits personified this combination. He was, above all, devoted to the idea that a public life was worth living and that public service was a great good, the highest good, in fact. As a testament to his effectiveness as a leader, Jack was voted the most intelligent man in the Senate at one point in his long career." Things were more bipartisan back then, and Jack, who believed in democracy of the United States with his whole being, worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make this country better. By the end of Senator Javits' career, he was widely regarded by members across the political spectrum as one of the most brilliant and hardworking members of the Senate. His legacy serves as an example to us all for how to effectively collaborate across political divides. Among his many accomplishments as a congressman and a senator, Senator Javits was especially proud of his role in creating the National Endowment for the Arts, his sponsorship of the ERISA Act for defined benefit private pensions, and his work that led to the passing of the War Powers Act in 1973. Senator Javits was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1983. The Jacob K. Javits Convention Center was named in his honor in 1986, and he passed away on March 7th of that year. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship at New York University was established in 2008 to honor the memory of the late senator and to perpetuate his values. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship is awarded to a distinguished individual, an academic, lawyer, policymaker, journalist, historian, philosopher, or former elected official whose work focuses on an issue close to the senator's interests. These areas include health, civil rights, labor, foreign policy, rights of individuals with disabilities, education, and fairness in employment and economic security. In a few moments, Sherry Gleed will introduce our honoree. Sherry Gleed is Dean of the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. A leading scholar on U.S. health policy reform and mental health care policy, Dean Gleed joined NYU in 2013 after a distinguished career at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, where she was professor of health policy and management. She also served as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. State Department of Health and Human Services under President Obama and was a senior economist for health care and labor market policy on the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents Bush and Clinton. Among her many honors, Dean Gleed is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Social Insurance, and the Board of Academy Health. Please welcome Dean Sherry Gleed.
Thank you, Sibel, and let me add my special thanks to Mrs. Javits, Carla Javits, and the entire Javits family. As Sibel mentioned, this appointment honors the legacy of Senator Javits and also Mrs. Javits' ongoing efforts to promote excellence in public service and educate the next generation of public service leaders. That is one of the reasons why we at NYU Wagner were so thrilled to learn that Tony Bertelli, one of our very own, was selected to be the 2015 Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professor at NYU. NYU Wagner prepares public service leaders to translate ideas into actions that have an effective and lasting impact. Our faculty of thought leaders frames the way in which people think about and act on issues of public importance. And our core values at Wagner are very much aligned with the work to which Senator and Mrs. Javits dedicated their lives, and so we are particularly thrilled to share in this honor. Tony Bertelli joined our community in 2014 as Professor of the Politics of Public Policy and Vice Dean for Academic Affairs and Research. As you can tell from his biography, which is included in the program, his scholarship and teaching focus on issues of governance, centering on the role of political institutions in shaping public policy, outcomes, and organizational structure. Tony has written and co-authored several books on this subject. His work has appeared in many scholarly journals, and he serves on the editorial board of several, including as the senior executive editor of the Journal of Public Policy. Tony joined us last year from Los Angeles, and critical to our ability to lure him here from the endless sunshine, he is a serious opera fan who met his wife Tamron, who's here in the front and they've been married for 1 month, at an opera benefit. In addition to Tamron and opera, Tony is also quite passionate about the critical importance of scholarship and also the value of politics. And I think you'll hear both those themes tonight as Tony talks to us about political accountability from a citizen's perspective. So now join me in welcoming Tony Bertelli.
Well, thank you all very much. And thank you, Sherry and Sibel, for those kind words of introduction, and very many thanks to Mrs. Javits and to Carla and the entire Marion B. and Jacob K. Javits Foundation for this wonderful program and for selecting me to be the Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professor this spring. I'm uniquely honored and tremendously proud to have received this professorship. It has given me the all too rare opportunity to reflect at length at some of the lessons I've learned in my research and teaching. This evening, I'll share my synthesis of my thinking on the issue of accountability in the contemporary world of public service. I will do this from a perspective that we all share, that of the citizen, rather than the jargon-kissed and all too disciplined at times perspective of the scholar. Recasting this story reveals a challenge for citizenship that requires both our engagement as citizens and the kind of statesmanship that Senator Javits cultivated and practiced during his long career. So let's begin with a hypothetical subway trip that became all too real for about 800 New Yorkers last October. While I was not among them, my first-person account is meant to emphasize the shared perspective as citizens that lies at the heart of my remarks this evening. So fall's chill was in the air as I left my office in the Puck Building on my way to Forest Hills. I descended the stairs into the subway, swiped my Metro card, and headed for the F train. It came quickly, and I boarded. And it was a surprise to no one that the train was crowded. As we neared 21st Street, we came to an abrupt stop and were told to disembark. It seems that a giant drill bit nearly plunged into the train. As I followed the crowd to alternative transportation, I wasn't merely thinking of the inconvenience I was suffering. Like the staff at the Daily News, my fellow passengers and I were left with a crucial, if vaguely constructed, question. The Daily News is really good at headlines. Watching the news that evening, I thought a reporter from Channel 5 asked exactly the right question. Who do you think is responsible? And this citizen very reasonably located responsibility for the wayward megadrill with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Passenger Stephanie Cruz initially agreed with this assessment and routinely blames the MTA for service disruptions. But the image of that giant drill was startling. It was out of the ordinary. She felt that her theory of an MTA operations lapse did not quite fit the situation, which begs a question: just what is the MTA? So the webpage tells me it's a public benefit corporation that has a state charter and a board of directors. It is designed to provide services and regulations for our benefit. And various politicians we elect make appointments to its board. Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, elected county executives in the metropolitan area, and these appointments are confirmed by the state Senate. My internet search reveals that the drill was being used during a phase of the East Side Access Project, which falls under the aegis of a unit called MTA Capital Construction. That agency focuses on infrastructure. It's relatively new, and it serves a coordinating function, one that had not been possible, I read, under an older structure that was rooted in a particular history and the particular history of transportation in New York. Board members are assigned to committees. Charles Merdler was appointed by the governor, and he serves on the relevant committee for subway projects in the city, the New York City Transit and Bus Committee. Both officials that I just mentioned offered a response. Michael Horodniceanu of MTA Capital Construction blamed the incident on operational stupidity. The guys kept drilling, he said. The drill was not operated by an MTA employee, and Mr. Merdler, less colorfully, promised a review of safety concerns for the contractors. He expected mixed results on the appropriateness of qualifications held by the contract employees on this project. So who are they? Who are these contractors? A large contract belonged to a firm called Tudor Perini, which certainly advertises the right background. That big drill was operated by a subcontractor called Griffin Dewatering, who was promptly blamed for the incident. And I was relieved to see they acted quickly to cover the hole that they had made. An MTA investigation seemed to support this allocation of responsibility. The drill operator missed his or her mark by 7 feet, but it seems was fully qualified to drill into the F train. So I was beginning to wonder whether I could really understand what happened and who might be responsible for it. The words of another citizen, a gas station manager working near the construction site, offered me some reassurance. The matter was rather simple. This drill could have killed or injured us. The operator was negligent, and the observant citizen's theory of negligence wasn't too far from that given by the MTA. 25 feet was just too deep to drill. So what could I do? I looked for a way to contact the MTA about the incident, and I found this really helpful page written by MTA's outreach and public information person who is dismayed that customers don't understand how to complain. She provides instructions to do just that. I took these instructions to heart, and I explained the situation as clearly as I could in the appropriate form on the MTA webpage. But writing this complaint left me feeling somewhat powerless. Someone should be punished for this, I thought. So I remembered the political appointments to the MTA board, and I smelled blood. I will find these officials on the ballot, and I will vote for someone, anyone else. Am I being rash and unreflective? So in my academic field of public administration, the context I have just described is called complex governance. The subway story highlights many of its common components. We saw a quasi-governmental organization. That was the MTA, which has both public and private features. We encountered hierarchies of authority, as we see in the MTA's organizational chart. We observed contracts and subcontracts with organizations of different sizes, areas of expertise, and structures. A careful eye would have spotted informal networks of actors, with board members interacting with each other on multiple committees and having appointment ties to different state and local officials. We felt the tension between a technical process that drilled into a subway tunnel and a prospective outcome, one that would give thousands of people a more efficient transit link between Queens and Manhattan every day. And last but not least, we felt a tension because someone should be held responsible for the drilling incident, but did these elected officials really deserve to lose our support because of it? I mean, those pictures might make you think that they so deserve. All of the unelected actors in the story that I've told this evening are doing what I'll call policy work. Elected politicians promise us a path to the outcomes we desire, like a better rail link between Manhattan and Queens. Policy workers exert effort toward making those outcomes real. There are lots and lots of policy workers, and you might even be one of them, as long as your effort is directed toward a legislated policy goal. Policy work is not just done by bureaucrats, like those effectively dehumanized in this painting by George Tooker, painted in 1956, called Government Bureau, and which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This was inspired by Tooker's own visit to the New York City Building Department, after which he moved to Vermont. We also saw that the drill operator working for Griffin Dewatering was a policy worker too. Now, the elected actors in the story that I've told face political accountability at the ballot box. Political accountability requires voters to look back at the performance of public officials who represent them and vote them out of office if their performance is unsatisfactory. Applying the logic of political accountability to policy work seems only logical, but doing so places a triple burden on voting citizens. They must first answer the question in my title: who are the policy workers and what are they doing? And then, if particular policy workers are doing something unsatisfactory, citizens need to find a way to sanction them. So recall that my trip to the MPA webpage left me with a web form for a complaint, right? Is that enough incentive for improvement? The problem of connecting policy workers to political accountability through elected representatives has left scholars in my field with more questions than answers. Their arguments range from extensive auditing of policy work to new theories of political accountability. Critically, though, what makes policy workers more identifiable and their work more evaluable by you, the citizens, and their mistakes more available to sanction, simultaneously makes elected officials less identifiable with policy work and harder to sanction for its mistakes. I'll try to make this point very clear in the rest of my lecture. What's more, my field remains focused on a particular group of policy workers, managers, rather than on the drill operator, whose discretion was broad enough. He could choose to drill up to 7 feet away. Nonetheless, his choices were narrow when compared with his manager, who might well have erred in designing the project's workflow. So let's consider 3 responses to complex governance, to this situation that I've drawn out for you, that my field has produced, but not from the perspective in which my field has produced them. from the perspective that we all share, that of the citizen. These three are managerialism, collaboration, and participation. So the first, managerialism, sees the policy worker, like a private sector manager, as allocating scarce resources. To allow her to do this in innovative ways that have the potential to unlock efficiencies, managerialists would hold her accountable for the ends of policy work, but not the means. Holding policy workers accountable for outcomes de-emphasizes the evaluation of process. Yet process was my only concern on the F train that fall afternoon. Moreover, because these outcomes are closely, often precisely, connected with the promises of elected officials, managerialism can shift blame away from politicians, for whom we can vote, toward managerial policy workers, for whom we cannot. Consider this example from the United Kingdom. The DVLA is like a national analog to the Department of Motor Vehicles. Always a great topic for talks about public administration, motor vehicles. It issues driver's licenses, it collects vehicle taxes, and it issues license plates. This leaves it with a great deal of information about UK citizens. It is essentially governed by a contract between an elected official, the Secretary of State for Transport, and the chief executive of the DVLA. This contract establishes performance targets, like maximum waiting times at DVLA facilities, and leaves process to be determined by the DVLA's chief executive, who is a policy worker. While this managerialist strategy focuses on outcomes, it can shift blame away from the elected Secretary of State when, for instance, the process of collecting and maintaining information about citizens is questioned. So a second response that my field has had to complex governance is collaboration or collaborative management. Here, the policy worker mediates the interests of many relevant actors. She maneuvers formal and informal networks and persuades policy workers to help her achieve her desired objectives. Unlike managerialism, this argument focuses attention not just on the policy worker, but also on her collaborators. It lessens her identifiability. And the skills for good collaboration, centered as they are on persuasion, read like a page out of the politician's playbook. Collaborative management creates a politics of its own that may be more removed from an elected official than we might expect. That secondary politics allows politicians to relocate blame with policy workers that are hard for us to individually identify, making it less likely that we will sanction politicians at the ballot box. Consider the case of parking meters in Chicago. Parking, another great topic for talks about public administration. A private corporation creatively named Chicago Parking Meters operates them and offers some popular programs such as mobile payment. CPM operates Chicago's meters through a monopoly concession that was created through an agreement with the city. It paid the city handsomely for this monopoly, right? $1.2 billion, and can claim the revenues it generates for a long time, until 2084. CPM exemplifies a collaborative concept known as the public-private partnership. Its managers collaborate with policy workers of all kinds and across sectors. But it's not terribly democratic, leaving the elected aldermen of Chicago out of the collaboration and allowing them to focus blame on CPM, on the former mayor, Richard M. Daley, and his negotiating team. And Chicagoans can't vote against them. While Mayor Emanuel has renegotiated this agreement, Daley's preceding deal constrained what he could do, and that constraint shifts blame as well. The biggest complaint from citizens comes in the cost of parking in the loop. and also this is an average across other business districts in the city. Right? Chicago's meter rates are recognized to be extreme, especially in relation to low-density, affordable cities like San Francisco or New York. And a third response that scholars have offered to the problem focuses more on our fundamental question of democracy. Right? It brings citizens themselves into policy work, but in a particular way. Here, citizens deliberate with each other and act as advisors to policy workers. Deliberations do not involve everyone, but smaller groups of citizens, what are called mini-publics. If you are in a mini-public, identification of policy workers and the evaluability of their efforts can be enhanced. But participation takes time and imposes opportunity costs that can be very high. Consequently, the representativeness of the mini-public is crucial to the democratic standing of participatory public administration. A well-cited article in this literature offers an intriguing view of the selection criteria for participating in policy work. Democracy means rule by the people. Everyone votes with equal weight. So inclusion is really important, right? Inclusiveness is a key criterion. The continuum shown here ranges from the least inclusive mechanism on the left to the most inclusive mechanism on the right. So while they're chosen in free and fair elections, our elected representatives' deliberations are considered exclusive. It would be better to allow citizens to self-select into participation with policy workers. Come in if you want to, is the mechanism. And despite what I've learned and taught in statistics, it also seems that self-selection is more inclusive than randomly selecting citizens to participate. So consider an example intertwined with healthcare reform that I can thank Dean Gleed for, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. This was established by an act of Congress in a quasi-governmental form that might well remind you of the MTA. To identify research priorities and to fund research in critical areas, the Institute is authorized to appoint expert advisory panels for assistance. These committees include experts from healthcare research and from clinical practice, but also from a group of citizens, patients. The mechanism for joining is open self-selection, and currently there are 7 advisory panels and a total of approximately 130 panel members, 5 of whom are patients or caregivers. One such patient is Perry Cohen. Mr. Cohen has Parkinson's disease, but also a PhD in management from MIT's Sloan School of Management, and a nonprofit advocacy organization that fights for the interest of Parkinson's patients. While Mr. Cohen is very qualified for policy work, participatory theorists would not have put him on the advisory panel for that reason, for the reason of his expertise. They would place a very high representational burden on one unelected patient in this case. What if the MTA established an expert advisory group for the East Side Access Project and made it open to passengers? Who among the population of passengers would choose to participate? So considering these responses to the problem of complex governance leaves us with a view of accountability that is likewise convoluted. Complex governance arrangements are socially valuable in that they marshal the expertise of many policy workers around thorny problems like transportation and healthcare. But my field's theories recast political accountability. They allow our representatives to shift blame to policy workers for problematic outcomes and processes, and take credit for things that make us happy. Curiously, I could not find a single public statement on the drill bit in the F train incident. incident by a public official, by an elected public official. Policy workers allocated the blame among themselves, leaving politicians little room to weigh in. So on the one hand, policy work that is detached from politicians can engender competence with just a light political flavor. On the other hand, it can weaken our sanctioning authority over politicians, as they shift blame to policy workers who operate in a complex setting under a veil of technocracy. And citizens find this veil tricky to pierce. While citizens choose the broad priorities of government and cannot be expected to monitor even simple details of policy work, we cannot allow our representatives to forget that the outcomes of policy work relate directly to our priorities for government. I think the responses to complex governance I've just described make this harder to do. As citizens, we do have a response to complex governance, and it's an old one. By informing our votes with our concerns, we create incentives for politicians to pay attention to policy work and to connect it with our priorities. Of course, engaging in interest group politics and more demanding forms of participation, like Perry Cohen's excellent work on behalf of Parkinson's sufferers, right, is powerful. Still, many of us simply cannot afford the time and opportunity costs that it requires. Political scientists have also shown that even very limited information about politics can help voters use rules of thumb that are good for accountability. So consider 2 rules of thumb that might be used to answer the accountability question: who are the policy workers and what are they doing? If you can identify a policy worker, given the information you receive from the media and other sources, give her the blame or give her the credit. Likewise, if you feel informed enough to think that her policy work was acceptable or unacceptable, then blame or credit the policy worker that you've identified. If you can neither identify nor evaluate, then blame a politician you think is close to the action. You might be wrong, but an accountable actor will have the right incentive because you expressed your voice. We all experience cues about policy work every day, and thinking about identification and evaluation can help us to process them. My F-Train story included a response in the top left quadrant. The person holding the drill was identified, not by name, and his or her company was blamed, right, for missing the mark by 7 feet. When evaluation is harder, the identified policy worker or her organization can rest their defenses on the complexity of the process. If multiple actors and organizations are involved, they may blame each other or blur the lines of responsibility. Both identification and evaluation are hard, and appeals to the complexity of policy work are likely when that is true. And this gives policymakers an effective form of independence. It's in these situations that our political participation is most important. We need to connect policy work with our basic priorities. We've been hearing many complicated stories about the causes of police brutality. So who are you holding responsible for it? The policy workers, police officers and their managers? Suspects and criminals, the mayor and the city council? Just remember that your vote only addresses that last group. Senator Javits was called a maverick for showing independence as his party's ideology began to diverge from his own views and those of his constituents. But it is the mark of a statesman to represent one's constituents, particularly in the face of such pressures. And that's what he did. Your political participation should give politicians the motivation to be responsive, not just partisan, and not to face the incentives of this politician lampooned in this issue of the New Yorker. We must root out corruption at the highest levels of government and make it look like it's happening at the lowest levels of government. Right? We can't vote for policy workers at those lowest levels, and he knows it. Moreover, turnout for local elections is just pathetic. So my message tonight is not simply to encourage you to cast a vote, but rather that you should be informed about the policy work that impacts you and to discuss it with other citizens. You may feel that one vote in a presidential race or Senate campaign does not amount to much, and I'll grant you that. However, down-ballot races for county executive and city council bring accountability to the positions closest to much of the policy work that impacts your daily lives in the greatest way. And this is where your engagement and your votes make the greatest difference. You also might feel that you don't know enough about the issues to really hold your elected officials accountable. Still, our democracy relies on you to set government's general priorities, from order and safety to education and healthcare, and the relative importance of each of those priorities. Your view of when policy work ignores those concerns is as valuable as mine in elections. Such equality of expression is very hard to achieve in even the most unrepresentative of many publics. And focusing only on outcomes and trusting collaborations too far will make your views less relevant. As votes inform our public officials and motivate them to pay attention to policy work that affects us, that policy work becomes more democratic. Experts can make policy work efficient and effective, but our system requires all of their plans to attend to our priorities as citizens. Thank you. All right. So I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
When we go to the polls, oh, sure. When we go to the polls to vote for governor, to vote for mayor, to vote for city council member, we're voting for somebody who the range of whose activity and the impact of whose work spans obviously a whole range of policy work and a whole range of organizations and what have you. It seems difficult, if not painfully impossible, to single out, say I'm going to vote against somebody because they almost drilled into the F train. Right. I'm not going to throw the governor out for that reason, what have you. Maybe I should. But so I'm interested to know, how does one single out the complexity of policy work in the face of a relatively simple electoral process?
Right, that's a great question. And I think that's the key attempt for me to be provocative tonight. But I also believe what I'm saying, right? So why not vote out the governor? Because your F train almost got drilled into. Yes, the governor pays attention to a lot of issues, but if you organize a campaign about transit safety, right, and you think that's really important, right, or even if you don't organize that campaign because you've got a full-time job and you can't join these kinds of groups, right? You're saying that I am putting pressure on the governor for the issue that is most important to me. I take the train every day. I want to be safe. I'm concerned about a lot of things in that train, and that's my issue. And single-issue politics is not something that is foreign to the American political system, right? And so the interesting problem, right, is that single-issue politics here enters into the retrospective evaluation of just you, just one citizen, and that's the disconnect. But there's nothing different between that and the position of a transit safety interest group. So, yeah.
Thank you. So on a day where we've seen the indictments of, the head of the New York Senate as well as the former New Jersey chair of the Port Authority, I'm wondering how you can take corruption into account, particularly with regards to contractor fraud that seems to be highly prevalent, particularly in public service, public works contracts, and also with regards to the electoral system in New York, which has a very highly opaque, redistricting process, as well as pretty archaic laws around, that kind of repress voter participation. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah. Well, no, all these things are fair, right? Because I'm trying to make a very simple statement about a very complex reality, right? And so the first response is that what you've seen in terms of corruption is precisely the kind of unacceptable policy work that you should be voting against, right? So are you interested in voting for Governor Christie in a presidential campaign? So if you're driven to say no to that, then you're doing the kind of thing that I'm talking about, right? And we all have these kinds of views, right? The other issue that you bring up is an important one, because you heard me criticize these notions of participatory democracy, right? Or participatory policy work, as I called it. And that was due to the representativeness of those mini-publics, right? And so what your second statement is really about the representativeness of elections, right? And that is a problem, right? Within the system that we have, we do have some issues of representation to deal with, right? But that is, of course, the system that we have. That's the system that brings you that allows you to go to the ballot box and cast your vote. And I will stick to my guns and say that if you see these things that you don't like, if there's corruption, that's unacceptable policy work. And if you think you can identify it, then you know what to do. And if a redistricting commission is created, and they're going to redraw the boundaries of the state, and you think, and you can evaluate, you're satisfied as a citizen that this will make the electoral map unrepresentative, that it will discriminate against groups, then say no.
Politicians always decry the ever-falling turnouts in elections, but shouldn't there be a mechanism to reflect the dissatisfaction with the voters for the choices that they're given, either proportional representation to deal with the fact that third parties are locked out, or what about a choice of none of the above, forcing another election with if none of the above wins and the majority candidates who lose not be allowed to run again?
So those are great alternative electoral systems to consider, right? They're not what you see when you go to the ballot, right? And what I've been trying to do for the purposes of this lecture is to focus on what you do have, right? And so it gives you an interesting trade-off, doesn't it, right? In the system that you have without none of the above, you can either not vote, or you can vote one of the opposition candidates who you may well not like, right? And that choice may not make you very happy, right? Although retrospective accountability is really important, right? And it's at the center of the way that our system is constructed. Being forced to vote for somebody that you don't particularly like gives you pause, right? But that's what you have, and you might want to give them a chance, right? So that being said, right, these issues about, or the issue about turnout is really something that I struggled with for purposes of this talk, right? Because I'm trying to find the least costly participation lever for you, right? Somebody doesn't agree with me, right? There's clearly somebody who's teaching a course in interest group politics in the law school. But the least costly alternative, and that's for you to turn out and vote. And I was thinking, well, what if you can't get over that cost threshold? What if you think it's just too costly to go out and vote? well, then I honestly don't know what to say, right? Because every other form of political participation is more costly than that, right? So turnout is depressed for a lot of different reasons. But if you feel the need to send a message to elected officials and you don't go out and vote, I actually don't have an answer I don't have a theory that would make you turn out in that case.
A lot of the emphasis that I've heard so far has been on the accountability of elected officials. However, you used in your lecture an analogy about police departments, and we just seen what happened in an entire county devoid of, even with the elected officials, but also the policy workers, all in collusion into apparently some type of conspiracy against its citizens. Wouldn't accountability, and you see this a lot, elected officials are not really responsible for some of the systems that persist, like police departments are here. Elected officials come and go. Transportation departments are here. Elected officials come and go. And they tend to develop their own cultures, their own do's and don'ts and rules and norms. And so shouldn't accountability also be looked at and heavily scrutinized with the policy worker as well?
Yeah, no. So this is a great question that fits directly within the literatures that I study, right? And this, in contrast to what I'm saying, is what the literature focuses on, right? So there's a large literature on something called accountability forums. And these are third parties who look at things like police departments, right? And these forums then there's recent work suggesting that these forums tend to drift themselves and that they start doing things that seem unacceptable in terms of policy work. And politicians may come and go, but they're the ones who are able to legislate a change in how the police department looks. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the system that we have, right? And so the literature tells a story of many accountabilities, right? Plural, right? And few of those are actually democratic in nature, right? But political accountability, the way I've mentioned it, right, the way I've referred to it, is the central democratic accountability that we have in a representative democracy, right? And so thinking from the citizen's perspective, right, knowing that that's the lever that they have to pull, literally in some jurisdictions, instead of these awful punch things that I never liked, or electronic ballots, which aren't particularly fun, right? That's the only lever that you have to pull. And if you can do that and retrospectively evaluate what's going on in your police department, right, at the time that you're saying, you know what, the mayor, he's done a lot of good things, but I can't forgive him for what's been happening, right? That's the kind of accountability that you have, right? These forums can provide more information for you. The transparency in the way that the police department does its work can provide more information for you to evaluate at the ballot box. But the ultimate political accountability rests with you and voting for those public officials. So Sonia is right next. Oh, either one.
What impresses me is just the distance between where the vote is and where the product is, and just the layers between that. And I was just wondering if you have thought of what the ideal structure might be that would minimize obfuscation and maximize transparency. Because the vote is not cast for the person that operates the drill bit. The vote is cast at a much, much higher level. And there's a great deal of processes between our vote and the drill bit operator. And I'm just wondering if you have thought of a structure that could exist that might maximize the effectiveness of our vote. Or perhaps it's not even a democratic structure. I don't know.
Goodness, no, right, is the short answer. But that's precisely what the complexity of policy work should impress upon you, right? What you should see is that accountability seems really, really hard if it's done through political means, if it's done through the ballot box. And it leads some people in my field not to think about that kind of electoral accountability all that much, to think about politics as kind of a constraint on the things that policy workers actually do, right? And it's not really a constraint. It's the means of selecting the broader goals of society and the relationship between policy work and the outcomes it produces and those broader goals, right? So it's not really easy to design a system in order to do that. The alternatives that I mentioned do provide for system design possibilities. Managerialism treats you like a customer, and it says if you're a happy customer, then you'll be happy with the policy work, right? And so it focuses your attention on outcomes, but sometimes outcomes aren't what matter, like with the drill bit, right? The participation alternatives try to bring you in, but they face, and they try to deal precisely with the kind of problem that you're seeing, to bridge the distance between the policy workers who are doing the real work and you, the citizen, right? But the problem is they struggle to be representative in doing that, right? They struggle to get people to participate directly, yeah.
I guess I was thinking about your example of the motor vehicle department. One of its criteria is how much time it takes to get a license,
yeah.
which might not be the best criteria to evaluate a system as complex as motor vehicles. And there might be better questions to ask within the system to get better accountability.
No, that's absolutely right. But that's a limitation of the managerialist idea, right? So if you can write a contract, you could certainly write a contract over other kinds of considerations. For example, data security, right? Which the headline I flashed suggested was a concern, right? So you could certainly do that, but you would have to pick that in advance, right? And so what the tension that you and I are dealing with in this Q&A right now is the interaction that's required for democracy to work, right? You don't know why you don't like what I'm going to do in the next month as a policy worker. But when I do it, you'll be able to retrospectively say, that wasn't really the best thing that you could have done, Tony. And I would like to hold you accountable for those outcomes that I don't particularly like, right? So you can do that, but it's the interactiveness that's very difficult to get right. The participation idea is really an important move in that direction, but the representativeness and maybe even alternative theory of how democratic accountability might work gets in the way of it.
I was thinking that there's another conceptual way to link that higher politician to the lower levels of the other policy workers that may be helpful to make your argument even stronger, and that has to do with the fact that if you think about the politician as a leader, then there's also a possibility of holding the person accountable for creating a culture through downward, trickling down, a culture that gives permission or not to policy workers at the lower levels to do certain things or not do other things. And I actually think the news that came out this weekend about Governor Christie's and the fiasco of the George Washington Bridge closed lanes is a very good example of that, where so the lower level people are being, not so lower, but the inner circle are being held accountable for what they did, and now there's a lot of evidence about that. And Christie's saying, see, it wasn't me. And I'm thinking, excuse me, if you did not create a culture and that tells your people how they should be acting or not, it is you who should be held accountable. So I think it's another interesting argument, and I wonder how you could connect that to the voting element and the other two, the participation and collaboration perspectives. Is there connection there?
No, it's an interesting observation, Sonia, and I think it is part of my argument, right? So what you called a culture, right, was the production of some sort of outcome from policy work, right, or a process, right, both of which can be evaluated. So we can't, as citizens, evaluate what Christie was really doing or whether he was involved. That takes a lot of information, right? But we can evaluate the process by which that information is given to the public or even considered, right, within the government, right? And so what you were calling a culture is something that's produced by policy work that relates to the general priorities we have for society, right? We don't really want a corrupt public administration. And when we don't want corrupt politicians, right? And we accept that politics and administration don't separate very easily, right? We don't want them to be exactly the same thing, which is what the bridge scandal really suggests, right? And so we want these kinds of things, and they relate to how we see the state. And that's an outcome that we can evaluate. So I think it's a piece of that. Yeah. Justin.
I wonder if you could speak about opt-in, opt-out mechanisms, like Oregon's recent move to automatically register you to vote if you're 18. You agree with like minimizing the amount of active choices that citizens need to make?
Well, I mean, more inclusiveness is good, right? Even if the continuum I showed you had some odd view of that, more inclusiveness is good, and I think that's good.
I heard you to say that we should be more aware of what you call policy work, exactly to narrow the gap between the political lever we have, which is the vote, and the actual performance of government. If we just accept the vote alone as our action, then the gulf is overwhelming, and it's not realistic. On the other hand, if we get deeply involved, it's too costly, and we can't do that. But you seem to be saying that if we know even a little bit about the policy work that affects us personally, the payoff is worth the extra effort, at least that much. So we should travel a little further away from the vote and know a little bit about the operations of government. Not a whole lot, because it's too costly, but enough so that the operators, the policy workers, can be sanctioned by at least by our opinion, and also give us a better basis for sanctioning the election, the elected officials.
That's exactly right, Larry. I should have had you give the talk. But that is what I'm saying. I mean, the normative point that I would make, right, is that you don't have to know that much about policy work in order to evaluate, right, what's going on. But something, right? And then once you know that, I just urge you to use it in a democratic setting. All right. Let's take one more question, and then I'm getting the hook.
Just to add the issue of competence to the system, you did mention it. So not just leadership, but who is competent? Presumably it is the governor or the top official. Who is competent to nominate those people who are not elected down all the way to the policy maker, and how and what's the judgment that goes in there?
That's right. So competence obviously does matter, right? Because that's the competence to do this policy work in the first place, right? And we know from the MTA example exactly which public officials are involved in nominating these people, right? So if you don't like the people they nominated, then you should think about that when you vote. But thank you all very much.